Hello, welcome to the third part of our third unit, factoring in our grade 10 academic math course. So we are working our way through factoring tricky trinomials by decomposition. This is going to be the last video for this because I just can't justify any more than that. So I'm going to stop talking and we're going to get right to it. So factoring tricky trinomials. So are there any common factors in 7x squared minus 78x plus 11? No common factors. So this is a tricky trinomial still. We want to find the thing that multiplies to our a and c value, so that's going to be plus 77, but that adds to negative 78. So when you look on your factor sheet, which I'll be sure to post, the two numbers that will lead us to multiplying to positive 77 but adding to negative 78 are negative 77 and negative 1. So we are going to, first, we're going to decompose this guy down to negative 77x and negative 1x. There's our plus 11, and there's our 7x squared. So I know I went fairly quickly through this. Again, finding the factors hopefully is something that will be more comfortable for you once we get our factor sheets rolling and we get used to using them. So now we are going to common factor from the first two terms. So what's the greatest common factor in 7x squared minus 77x? The greatest common factor will be 7x, and when we factor that out, we will be left with x minus 11. And now we are going to common factor the second two terms in our four-term polynomial. Again, I do want to point out that this is a negative leading term in the second group, which means we're going to be factoring out a negative number here. The greatest common factor to negative x plus 11 is negative 1. And when we factor that out, we'll be left with x minus 11. Now, as I said before, if you struggle to see how factoring a negative 1 out of a positive 11 results in negative 11, that is something that I explained at the end of the second video. So now we have two terms left, this guy and this guy. The greatest common factor to both of them is that binomial, x minus 11. And when I common factor x minus 11 out of the first term, I'm left with 7x. That's it right there. And when I common factor x minus 11 out of the second term, I'm left with minus 1 right there. And that is factoring by decomposition for example C. Let's jump over to example D. So again, are there any common factors that we can factor out of all three terms? There are not. So this is still a tricky trinomial, so we are going to look for something that multiplies to plus 100. And again, just to recap on that, that's positive 4 times positive 25, but that adds to plus 20, and that is just our regular old b value hanging around there on the linear term. So as we look at our factor sheet for 100, we see that plus 10 and plus 10 will be the two values which when multiplied together give us positive 100 and added together give us plus 20. So first step, as before, we are going to decompose our plus 20x down into plus 10x and plus 10x, and then we're going to rewrite the first term in the first spot and the second term in the second spot. Now we have four terms there. We are going to common factor from just the first two of them. And the greatest common factor of 4x squared plus 10x is going to be 2x. And when I factor 2x out of 4x squared, I have a 2x. And when I factor 2x out of 10x, I have plus 5. Now we're going to common factor the second two terms in that four-term polynomial. The greatest common factor to 10x and 25 is going to be 5. And when I factor 5 out of 10x, I'll be left with 2x. And when I factor 5 out of 25, I'll be left with 5 again. Now I'm down to two terms again. This term right here, this term right here. What is the greatest factor common to both of them? Well, it's the binomial. It's the 2x plus 5. This guy that is common to both. And when I factor that out of my first term, I'm left with 2x. And when I factor it out of my second term, I'm left with plus 5. Now this is an interesting case where my two binomials are identical, which means that I can write them in an even more factored way as 2x plus 5 all squared. And that's how you factor, that's how you work with something you factored where the two binomials end up being the same at the end. Let's head over to question E. So we have 6x squared minus 28x minus 10. Are there any common factors that we can factor out here? Yes, there are, which is nice. So the greatest common factor that you can factor out of 6x squared minus 28x and minus 10 is just a 2. And when I common factor 2 out of 6x squared, I'm left with 3x squared. When I common factor 2 out of negative 28, I end up with negative 14x. And when I common factor 2 out of negative 10, I'm left with negative 5. So, unfortunately, though there was a common factor, the resulting trinomial was still a tricky try, because the coefficient in front of the x squared term is not 1, it's 3. So, to factor this tricky trinomial, I want to find the numbers that multiply to negative 15. Now again, I want to make sure that we got this. This is not from the original trinomial. We're using the a and c values from our factored trinomial. So we want to find the thing that multiplies to negative 15 rather, and that adds to negative 14. So the combination that will work here will be negative 15 and plus 1. So my first task is to decompose the negative 14x down into negative 15x plus 1x. It's me breaking that into pieces. There's my last term, there's the minus 5, there's the 3x squared, and of course all of that is inside a bracket because I can't get rid of the 2 that we common factored out front already. So now, as before, that 2 out front doesn't change anything. We'll just pop that 2 back out there. And now what we're doing is we're looking for the greatest common factor in our first two terms inside the bracket. So 3x squared minus 15x, the greatest common factor is going to be 3x. And when I factor 3x out of 3x squared, I'm left with an x. And when I factor 3x out of negative 15x, I'm left with negative 5. And now I'm going to common factor the second two terms in my quadratic, in the contents of my bracket, the 4 terms that are there. The greatest common factor is 1, which leaves me with in my bracket x minus 5. Now you'll notice that with some extra bracketing, I added a square bracket there. You can do double round brackets. It doesn't really matter to me how you do it. Okay, so now we have inside our bracket 2 terms left. We've got this guy and we've got this guy. So what is the greatest common factor there? Well, the 2 still has to keep going out front, but the greatest common factor to both of those terms is x minus 5. That's this binomial right here. And when I common factor x minus 5 out of the first term, I'm left with 3x. And when I common factor x minus 5 out of the second term, I'm left with plus 1. And that is a big, beautiful, factored, tricky trinomial using decomposition and common factoring, I guess. All right, one more. We're going to get it finished. So we have 9x squared minus 24x plus 16. Any common factors that we can factor out? There are not. So unfortunately, we're left with some larger numbers, but that's okay. We want to find the two numbers that multiply to a times c, which in this case is 100, positive 144, and that adds to our middle value, negative 24. Again, that's just the coefficient in front of the linear term. So we want to find the two things that multiply to plus 144 and add to negative 24. The answer will be negative 12 and negative 12. So our first task is to decompose the middle term down to minus 12x and minus 12x. Then first term and last term going back in. Okie doke. So now we have 4 terms, we're going to common factor the first 2. So what is the greatest common factor in 9x squared minus 12x? That's going to be 3x. And when we common factor 3x out of 9x squared, we're left with 3x. And when we common factor 3x out of negative 12x, we're left with minus 4. Now we're going to common factor the second 2. And again, I want to note we have a negative leading term here, so we're going to be factoring out a negative number. So the greatest factor common to both negative 12x and plus 16 is going to be negative 4. And when we common factor negative 4 out of negative 12x, we're left with 3x. And when we factor negative 4 out of plus 16, we end up with negative 4. Now we have 2 terms, this one and this one. And what is the greatest common factor common to both of them? It happens to be that binomial, that 3x minus 4. So I'm going to common factor that out front. Once I common factor that out front, what am I left with in my brackets? 3x and minus 4. Now again, what's interesting here is we've ended up with 2 identical binomials, which we write as 3x minus 4, whole thing being squared. And that is factoring by tricky trinomials by decomposition. The worksheet that we have for homework is a factoring tricky trinomials and differences of squares. The questions I've assigned here, number 1 odds, 2 odds, and number 3, are all tricky trinomial ones. So good luck with this homework. As I said, don't beat yourself up about this one. This is the most challenging lesson of this unit, and maybe one of the most sort of academic concepts we're going to tackle in this course. So hang in there, be persistent. If you have any questions, you can feel free to email me. Otherwise, good luck, and we'll see you in lesson number 4.